Welcome, everyone. My name is Walt Rogers. I'm the Deputy Director of TEF Iowa, Tax Education Foundation of Iowa. And today we are here with Dave Trabert, who is the president of Kansas Policy Institute. He's going to give us a presentation about making better use of your taxes. And I'm really interested because he's going to talk about how cities and counties can cut taxes without cutting services. I was a state legislator for many years, and that was always an issue. So we are very much interested in finding out about that, Dave, and happy you're here. So take us through it. Thank you so much for being here and take us through this whole thing.
Okay, well, thanks, Walt. Before I get into the presentation, I'll give you a little bit of background. When Kansas tried to cut state income taxes a few years ago, we had a lot of conservatives, frankly, coming to us saying, look, we love the idea of cutting taxes, but how are we going to run government on less money?
Right.
And so that prompted us to go out and do the research. And what we found was it's just a choice. I mean, if you think about it, every state provides the same basket of services. And there's education and transportation and social services and so forth. But the states that have an income tax spend 56% more per resident providing those services than the states without an income tax. It's just how much they choose to spend to provide those services. And the same thing really applies to all levels of government. So let me, with that set up, I'll share my screen here. Okay, so let me give you a little bit, you're probably all very well aware of this, but just for the record, Kiplinger's says Iowa is the 8th worst state for taxes on retirees. That's just one of the reasons why Iowa cities and counties aren't competitive. You know, we're not competing with kind of each other across the state. We're competing all across the nation, if not all across the world. The Tax Foundation says Iowa has the 29th highest state and local sales tax and the second highest business state tax climate, or I'm sorry, the 28th business tax climate. And what that means is businesses have 27 better options than going to Iowa or staying in Iowa. And the Lincoln Institute of Land Policy also says Iowa has some very high effective property tax rates. Here's some examples. Iowa obviously is highlighted in gold, and I've put some neighboring states on this chart. And the two at the bottom, Utah and Tennessee, are there because they have truth in taxation laws, which prohibits local officials from saying, you know, we're holding the line on property tax while they're raking in giant increases from valuation changes. They've had those laws in effect for more than 30 years. Kansas just passed that law this year with some improvements. But just to give you the impact here, let's look at a rural commercial property, $1 million value. In Iowa, that property is paying $30,000, where in Utah or Tennessee, they're paying less than half of that. Same property, just a different state. You look at the homestead. A $150,000 house in rural Iowa pays $2,800 in property tax, but only $1,000 in Utah and less than $1,000 in Tennessee. Look over on the other side at the urban areas so that same $1 million property in Des Moines pays $41,000 in tax versus $14,000 in Utah, $16,000, almost $17,000 in Nashville. These differences are really stark and create very significant barriers to economic growth. Here's some more information just to set the background why this is so important that cities and counties learn how to reduce taxes. Iowa is just about the worst in the nation for private sector job growth between 1998 and 2019 with just a little under 12%. Kansas is bad too. The national average was 31%. Idaho is at 50. Utah is at 67%. You look at how much Iowa lost $1.9 billion in adjusted gross income from more people choosing to leave than moved in between 2015 and 19. This is IRS data from the domestic migration. And as you can see, the numbers got significantly worse over the last 3 years. These are not good trends. So I'm going to talk to you now about some of the things that are in our 2021 Green Book, which we put out every year, and it explores the relationship between the size of government and economic growth. There's a lot of information in here on state comparisons, a variety of topics. I'm only going to touch on a few. One of the reasons that Iowa has high taxes is it is massively overgoverned. It's the 9th worst state in the nation for cities and counties and townships when measured by a number of residents per government, with 3,000 residents in Iowa versus a national average of 8,400. That's almost 3 times the number of cities and counties and townships than the national average on that basis. Iowa is the 6th worst for local government employees per capita. You're 14% above the nation. If you were at the national average on a per capita basis, you'd have 16,000 fewer local government employees. And if you say that each one costs about $50,000 all in with benefits and everything, that's an $800 million excess taxation bill that's coming from that. Now, don't feel bad. Kansas is even worse. So you're not at the bottom, but you're not in good shape. We've got an even bigger hill to climb here.
I'm assuming that government employees, that means school too.
Yes, that's the census definition of local government employees. So it includes school districts. This is looking at your local government property tax increase over the last 20 years. And it's up 126%. Now, we're talking about dollars here. I know local officials like to talk about mill rates, but people pay their taxes with dollars. So we measure tax increases in dollars. 126% is almost 2.5 times as much as the combined rates of inflation and population over that period. The gap is only getting worse. Here's another one, another different way of looking at it. Over that same period, there's been a 9% population increase, but a 15% increase in local government jobs. What's the justification for that? It's just costing a lot more and raising taxes. Inflation was 43%, but again, you had a 126% property tax increase. Now we're moving into how do you cut taxes without cutting services? And it's the same premise as we started with on the state basis. We found this in looking at counties across Kansas. So it's 105 counties in Kansas. And we divided this is from 2018. We looked at it on a per resident basis. And then as you can see here, we grouped them by population size, because there's obviously going to be some differences with that dramatic swing. But if you look at the small ones, less than 3,000 population, there's 24 counties. The spending per resident ranged from a low of $1,800 to almost $5,800 per resident. What services are they getting in the county spending $5,700 that they aren't getting in the county spending $1,800? That's not to say that $1,800 is possible for every county, but when you know that there are these enormous differences and you know that there are counties spending a lot less, you know it's possible to do so. The key is you just have to go look for it. This is all across, you see the ranges. It doesn't really matter. The multiples change. If you get into the big counties, it's just a little more than double instead of almost 4 times as much. But this just shows us that it's just like with the states. It's just a matter of how much each government chooses to spend to provide their services. That previous slide was on total spending. This is just what the census calls general government spending. And again, it's look at the $540 up to $1,363. It is just there's no rhyme or reason to this. It's just whatever they're choosing to spend. So how do you go about identifying the opportunities? The key, we think, is using performance-based budgeting. Now, this is different. Basically, I've not found a government yet, in Kansas at least, that has performance-based budgeting. They don't even have a budget process. They have an appropriations process. You know how the game works.
Yep.
We spent this much last year, or we budgeted rather this much last year, and here's how much more we want this year. And of course, if we don't get that, then the police are all going to get fired. It's how the coercion game goes. So you're basically held up for ransom. A performance-based budgeting system starts with, whether you do this by a city or a county or by different departments within, you start by prioritizing every program and service that's provided. And there can be no ties. I've done this exercise a few times with some counties, and right away it's like, well, everything's important. That's not the point. Which one is the most important? And the reason you need to do that is that when the time comes, and there always will be a time coming when you have to shave a little bit of spending, you want to make sure that you're taking that money away from the lowest priority that you have. If you don't, you're guaranteed to take it away from the highest priority you have. Next step is to establish measurable goals for every one of those programs or services. In other words, how are we going to measure success? And it should be based on the mission of that program and service. You want to be careful, though, that you're not looking at not measuring activity. You want to measure real progress. So, for example, if it was a program or an agency that was designed to work with underprivileged people and provide a safety net, you wouldn't want to measure the number of people you are dealing with, because you want to be dealing with less. The real goal is to get people off poverty. You're providing a safety net. So you might want to be looking at your number one priority of how we're going to measure is getting people transitioned so that they are independent. And you'll notice at this point, up to this point, we've not talked at all about money. When you start getting into the money, you want to look at the out-of-pocket costs. So there's going to be overhead and administration and so forth that's going to be there no matter what. You really want to understand, if we cancel this program, how much cost goes away. And that also allows you then to measure the cost per unit of output. And so you can compare across different agencies. This is really important, like if you're comparing a city and a county, if they both have the same type of program, which one is providing more bang for the buck? Or at the state level, where you might have a dozen agencies providing similar services. You want to be able to have a way of comparing them. And then before we get into the actual budget review, you want to look back and you want to say, did we meet our objectives last year? And if not, what are we going to do about that? This is not something that ever happens, at least in Kansas. It just never happens. They don't even think about it. I kind of get that way my dog looks at me when we start talking about these things. You want to look at all the different measurables and make an analytical justification for everything you're going to do differently. So, one of the excuses we hear a lot is, well, we have to raise taxes because our costs are going up. We have inflation and utility rates are going up. Well, you know what? Taxpayers are getting those too. And the governments are making it worse by adding a tax increase to their burden. So you have to really go through this and analyze, how is this new, when you start looking at the budget, now how is this new program or this additional spending going to improve our success? It's not just, not because it's a good idea. You want to go back and measure it against your objectives. It's frankly what a lot of companies do all the time. And it's probably a lot of what individuals do all the time. Governments just don't do that. Now, I mentioned earlier the truth in taxation, and John asked me to also touch a little bit on the Kansas version of truth in taxation. And it was just passed this year, but it went into effect July 1. And so starting this year, when the new valuations came in, our mill rates were automatically reduced so that the new valuations brought in the same dollar amount of property tax to every city, county, school district, town, whatever. Every local taxing authority in the state is subject to this. Then if the entity, say a city, wants to raise property taxes, they have to notify you of what they intend to do and when they're going to hold a public hearing for you to come bring, you can bring your pitchforks, tar and feathers, whatever you want to bring, and have a conversation with the elected officials about their proposal to raise your property tax. And then they just take a vote. There's no limit on what they can tax. They just have to be honest about the entire tax increase they're imposing. That means there's no more backdoor increases. There's no more people claiming we're holding the line. Everyone's going to know what you voted to do. I'll give you one example of how effective this is. In Utah, we based this off of the Utah law. We made some changes to it. One of which is there's no exceptions and no loopholes. Utah's effective property tax rate declined by 7.5% over the last 20 years, while in Kansas, it went up 22%. We had a former Utah Senate president come in and talk to our legislators about it. And when he saw those two numbers there at the bottom of the screen, he said, oh yeah, without truth in taxation, we'd be paying 30% higher property tax in Utah, no question. And it's only been in effect for a very short period of time in Kansas, but it's already working. We're in the process now of, we did open records requests with all 105 county clerks, and we're gathering this information so we can put it on one website where you can go not only search and find out when the hearings are going to be, but you can compare what your city or county is doing to other cities and counties. We've already had, we just passed 50 cities, counties, and even a couple of school districts that have said they are not going to exceed their revenue neutral rate this year. And that means they're not taking in $1 more of property tax than they are right now. There's a lot of others proposing very small increases. And this is over time. We know this is going to save Kansans hundreds of millions of dollars in the coming years, because even just reducing the rate of growth by 1 point saves $52 million a year.
Wow.
So we did a few other things were in that property tax package that we did. I'm not going to run through them all, but there were about a half dozen each on the valuation process and others on the appeals process. And we're happy to go into more details on that in the future if you'd like. And so just to wrap this up, it really comes down to the amount of money that cities, counties, schools, or the state chooses to spend to provide services. That's the only thing that determines how much they choose to tax. They can provide the same or better quality at lower costs. We've shown that some of them are already doing it. And we know that higher taxes are a major deterrent to economic growth. And we sure hope that truth in taxation can come to Iowa. Let's take some questions.
Very good. Sounds like you're doing some excellent things there in Kansas, which we would love to emulate. So, but I got a bunch of questions because, when I think about this, being a former legislator and somebody in government, you've got to have the leadership to do all these things. When you talk about the fact that it's their choice, I love the way you laid it out, that we've got to meet certain objectives. We've got to have a performance-based idea of what we're analyzing. So my first question is, how do you determine that? Like, go think about the performance-based aspect that you were talking about. How do you determine that? Who do you get in the room, and how do you know that they're having good faith of making the right decisions?
Well, in Kansas, we passed a performance-based budgeting law a few years ago. Unfortunately, legislators gave the state 3 years to implement it, and no one took ownership of it. Like most things, you can have good policy on paper, but you really need good leadership. So it really requires a strong governor to make sure that their cabinet secretaries know that this is not something you just talk about and it goes away. It will be done, or we'll find new people who will make it get done. And so then you have to go through and you let the agencies, you kind of let them do their own homework initially, but then there needs to be a serious review process. It's not easy to do. And Kansas, as a result of no one taking ownership of this, we have it on paper, but we really don't have a performance-based budget system in Kansas. It's just there in name only.
Well, I think we have a strong governor here, but
You do.
but we don't have that law that says you got to do performance-based budgeting. So,
Well, with a strong governor, though, they could just do it on their own.
right, exactly. I want to talk a little bit about schools. I mean, how much? I know in Iowa, 54% of the state budget is schools, and the locals, I think it's around right around 50% too. The local budget for local. Talk to me a little bit about that dynamic of schools, because we all know if you're in government, that's the biggest push that we're getting from is we need more money for schools.
Okay, so schools, yeah, that's a really tough question, especially here in Kansas, where they sue us if they don't get everything they want. And unfortunately, we have a Supreme Court that thinks it's part of the legislative branch and has no problem ignoring the state constitution to declare that it has the authority to tell legislators how much to spend. And so we've not had a real chance for the last 10 years to look at, to try to force schools to spend more efficiently. Because we've been and still are in that one lawsuit that started in 2010. But absent that, it's no different than any other process. It is you could develop a funding formula that could be based on the cost, kind of an average cost of delivering a service. That's just one way of doing it. And we actually I worked with a couple of legislators a few years ago, putting a model like that together. It was really interesting looking at it. And in the process, because you're looking at things like, all the usual functions, the cost centers like transportation and food service. And just like we saw with those counties, wild ranges in what they were choosing to spend to provide those services. One concept that we've talked about here, and parents frankly love it, is taking all of the non-instructional services out of the district and having those provided by regional service centers, which in Kansas, they're also school districts by law. But you could provide, we have 286 school districts, which means we have 286 transportation systems and food systems and everything else. You don't need all that. All the back office stuff, you need services where the attendance centers are, but the management of that can be centralized. You get enormous purchasing power if you put that all together. And that's something that legislators could do, is change how services are delivered.
How is Kansas moving along in that direction? That's an excellent paradigm that you put forth. How quickly are you guys moving to that, and how quickly can you move towards that?
In our case, we can't. They won't move on it until they get rid of this court case. But once that court case is done, or frankly, this is a case where if you had enough support in the legislature, and we have a very Republican legislature, but it's not necessarily that much of a conservative legislature. We have a lot of folks here who use one label and vote a different way. And so it's really hard to get enough people. What they frankly should have done when the court came out and said, you must do this, they should have just stood up and said, thanks, we appreciate your opinion, see you later. Yeah. Because they don't have the authority to do that. But eventually we need to get to that point of forcing that. In the meantime, what Kansas did do, we just passed this law, it requires school districts to certify that when they built their budget, they put enough money in instruction so that they, in their own estimation, that's enough money to get kids to grade level. And so now if they come back and try to sue the next time, and I'm sure they will. We've at least built a good legal defense that no, you certified that you had enough money to educate kids. You maybe didn't have enough money to buy the next Suburban or to get some new AstroTurf, but you said you had enough money to educate kids. So you have to try to find some ways to corral it. Another thing that the more that you can expand choice, the more likely schools are going to take this on their own.
Right. Are you talking expanding school choice and more options there?
Right.
Did Kansas do anything this past year with that?
We did. We had a tax credit scholarship passed in 2014, and we've expanded it a couple of times. And this year we really expanded it. So now it used to be just low income kids in the 100 worst schools. Now it's more like low and up into middle income in any school grades K through 8 across the state. So there's a lot more kids eligible for it. And we got within one vote of passing an education savings account bill.
One vote.
Yep. One vote, and it was a Republican. But you'll love this, not because he didn't like the concept. He said this, he was angry at the Senate president, and he didn't want the Senate president to have a win. So now, of course, our governor would have vetoed it anyway. But still, we got pretty darn close. We got it through the House and just died in the Senate there. But that would have made any student below grade level eligible for an education savings account, or any student with disabilities, including dyslexia.
Right.
So we're going to come back next year and we're going to add some new triggers to that bill. You'll also be able to get an ESA if you attend a district that implements a vaccination mandate or a mask mandate, or if they teach some really objectionable material like critical race theory. It's their choice to do those things. So we'll give parents a choice of where they want their kids to go. Excellent.
I'm excited to see, you saw West Virginia pass an almost all universal ESA, and excited to see some of the numbers come out of West Virginia, because I'm pretty heavily into that issue. And if you study that issue, the numbers are going to be good because it's positive on every aspect, actually for the public school too. So
it is. And I'll be happy to send you a link, or we can do another discussion about this, but we've been following what Florida did over the last 20 years. We sent a film crew down and made a documentary of what they did and what difference it made. And so you hear it from Governor Jeb Bush, you hear it from the head of the Miami Urban League and principals and so forth, even a parent. And we contrast that against what Kansas did. Florida went from almost the worst in the nation in 1998 to now among the best in the nation in 2019. Just leapfrog past a lot of states, and they did it while they spent $5,000 per student less than the national average. It's not money. It's a matter, what it came down for them was accountability, choice, transparency, and the courage to implement those changes.
100%. And I believe the more we implement choice around the country, people will start seeing the positive effects, and we're actually spending less money getting better education. So
yeah, and the tipping point, at least here in Kansas, is when parents understand the truth about student achievement. Because we have our school board association, the school's lobbyists put out a report every year claiming that Kansas is among the 10 best states in the nation for student achievement. They're not bothered by the fact that has never even been remotely close to being true. In reality, Kansas is now a little below average in a nation that doesn't perform very well. And so when parents find out, for example, that we have more high school kids below grade level than we have on track for college and career, they bring out the pitchforks, just like they do for the mask mandates and the property tax increases. That's the key. Helping people understand that there is a need for change is going to really pave the path to get it.
So switching gears a little bit back to the truth in taxation that you guys did and just implemented it and seeing results so quickly, that is a really positive thing. You said that you kind of expanded Utah's law and made no exceptions, no loopholes. Can you explain that a little bit more?
Sure. So the Utah law had a carve out for, they called it a growth factor. So they didn't include the valuation increase from new construction coming on every year as part of their revenue neutral calculation. We didn't do that. It doesn't matter whether it's from growth or anything else. It's just really simple. Everything counts. It doesn't matter how little amount of property tax you take in. Every taxing entity at the local level is subject to this with no exceptions and no carve outs. And the only reason the state isn't part of it is the state only has 1.5 mils of property tax for operating purposes that goes to an education building fund, university building fund. We tried to take that off, just abandon it, and put that spending into the regular appropriations process. That didn't pass, but we'll come back and get that done eventually.
Yeah. Dave, talk to me about, I assume you guys were helped getting that legislation passed. Talk to me about roadblocks that you had getting it done and getting it through.
Yeah, there were a lot of roadblocks. We were when we had some great legislative partners in the House and the Senate, and also outside the legislature, our state chamber of commerce, Americans for Prosperity, the realtors, the ranchers. I mean, we had a lot of groups behind us. We were the ones leading the charge with all the research and the messaging, and that was a big key to getting it passed. The objections, well, let's put it this way. There were a lot of objections from local government, but none of them that we found to be, or legislators, frankly, found to be very legitimate. So they said, oh, well, we already do this. We have a budget hearing. We tell people how much we're going to increase property taxes. We all know that's not true. They said, this is going to be too expensive. Oh my goodness, this is going to be so much extra work on the county clerks and everybody. They have to hold all these hearings. And you know what? Isn't it interesting that when they want to raise a tax, they will say, well, we have to do this, because the public demands it. So we showed them statewide polling that said 75% of Kansans demanded truth in taxation. So you guys better darn well give it to them. And we also showed them how it was really not that much effort. I mean, once you knew that this was coming back in March, county clerks could have just put together a spreadsheet dropping in the existing property tax collected by each entity. And then when you get the new valuations, you just drop that in and the formula says, here's your revenue neutral rate. Right. And you notify people. It's extra work, yes, but it's something that public demands. And so you get it done. We had a lot of messaging that worked on this to really drive the point home. And we built it around being honest. We had a special
That's
website.
Really the issue, right? It's the honesty gap that is the issue of.
We talked about the honesty gap. The honesty gap is the difference between, like you saw, 126% property tax increase in Iowa. And I don't have the mill rate, but let's say the mill rate was up on average 20%. That 106 point difference is the honesty gap. That's what they're not telling you about. That's the tax increase coming from the backdoor valuation change. We created a website called BeHonestKansas.com, and it had 2 E's in it, BEE. Our communications director is brilliant. She created a hornet because, property tax stings. And she had some really great graphics, the messaging. And we also had, we could produce graphs like you saw for Iowa. We had that for every county. We had that for all the major cities so people could see. And we let legislators see what was going on. People were saying there were all kinds of excuses. But here's the one what it really came down to. In the hearing, city and county officials lined up, and I'll paraphrase it. They said, well, if we do this, we won't be able to raise taxes as much. And we can't have that because the public just isn't smart enough to understand what has to be done. We have to do this for them. And so it's just kind of for their own good that we lie to them. Again, I'm paraphrasing, but that's really what it came down to.
Right.
You know, the rest of us just aren't smart enough to know what needs to be done.
Wow. And
And
that,
so we told that story. I mean, it was just because a lot of this, you know what it takes. You've been in the legislature. It takes people really getting upset about something to change because nobody likes change. And so we found really good ways to help people get very upset with the people who were in the way of change.
well, Dave, I appreciate so much just the, getting educated from what you guys' experiences were and what's happening in Kansas. And we're excited to learn some more. And as we get data from what you guys are doing, that'll help us here in Iowa to move in that direction too.